Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon keynote. I hope you all had a wonderful day today. I've been meeting people in the corridors, and I was so happy to see so many people excited about the sessions that they've been to. So that's a very good start, first day for the conference. So thank you, everyone who's here today. For what I think will be a very interesting presentation and then discussion that follows afterwards. So I would like to welcome Uzodimma Uwala to the stage. And for those who don't know him, Uza is an award-winning writer, filmmaker, and the medical doctor by profession. He is also the CEO of the African Center in New York, which is dedicated to promoting a new narrative about Africa through a focus on culture, policy, and business. And I think that angle of new narrative is something that's going to come up a lot during today's discussion. He's also the CEO and chief editor and co-founder of Ventures Africa magazines. A publication that also covers business policy and culture in Africa. So without taking up much of your time so that we have a good time for discussion, Uza, please.
Thank you, Mohammed. And good afternoon, and thank you to all of you for being here. Are you guys here? All right, so good afternoon to everyone. All right, there we go. I'd just like to know that there are people in the audience, you know what I'm saying? It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the World Conference of Science Journalists for having me to speak. I want to start with a set of images that have been seared into my head for some time now. So 2 years ago, on August 11th and 12th of 2017, white supremacists descended on the town of Charlottesville, Virginia, with their Confederate flags, their swastikas, and their symbols of Odin, to protest the removal of a statue of revered slaveholder and American terrorist, the Confederate hero and Civil War general Robert E. Lee. I remember watching this unfold on television, shaken as on the night of the 11th, young white men sporting perfectly groomed hair, wearing khakis and white golf shirts, streamed through the night carrying tiki torches, shouting, "You will not replace us." A chant directed at all the darker-skinned people like me, who, as the Anti-Defamation League has reported, represent the rising tide of color purportedly controlled and manipulated by Jews. I remember abject despair as I watched video footage of a car driven by the white supremacist James Alex Fields, plowing into a multiracial group counter-protesting the white supremacists, and killing one person, a white 32-year-old paralegal named Heather Heyer, who had been out there to protest for the day. The threat of racial mixing was just too much for these Make America Great alt-righties. They had to fight back or risk losing their country and their civilization to the great sullied horde of dark-skinned immigrants and possible miscegenation. I texted a friend, "Are you watching this? This is crazy," because what else could one say? Shortly thereafter, a number of US newspapers put out articles about a new phenomenon. Many of these white supremacists were using home DNA ancestry tests to confirm their racial purity, and thus their superiority. They would order 23andMe kits online, spit in the tubes, and send them off, anxiously awaiting to receive those color-coded charts that show a percentage breakdown of where your DNA comes from. According to the news articles, when these men, and they were mostly men, received the results, they would either triumphantly post to the online communities 4chan and Reddit, or seek consolation from their online brethren about the newly discovered lack of purity. I consumed these articles with increasing fascination and not a little bit of horror. Then 4 days after the Charlottesville terrorist rallies, I ordered my own 23andMe DNA test kit. It's taken me this long to understand why. Identity is everywhere these days, or so it seems. Turn on the news wherever you are in the world, but especially in the West, the United States, or Europe, and one is exposed to this incredibly persistent, and depending on your politics, pernicious question of identity as it relates to immigration. If you're a true European, widely understood to be a white person who claims a connecting genetic ancestry to this landmass, or if you're a real, in quotes, American, a term that has gained purchase in our present season of anime, which we now all understand to mean a white person in the United States, then you've probably been told that you should feel overrun by these people. Excuse me, I mean overwhelmed by this issue. In the United States, we chant, build a wall, separate brown-skinned children from their parents and warehouse them in desert concentration camps. Here in Europe, bananas are being thrown at African football players, and boats of black and brown families are being left to drown in the Mediterranean. These people, these others, of which I am one, as marked by our strange cultural practices, but most especially our darker skin, want what you have. We want to live in the world you created with your universal enlightenment philosophies that have made you logical, rational beings who have used science to build better societies that keep you well-fed, healthy, and resourced enough to continue the hard work of bettering your lot. You look at us with our dark skin coming from distant lands about which you hear tales of penury, war, and woe, and you think, who are these people? Why do they live like this? And why have they not been able to build worlds like ours? It's an incredibly enticing path of inquiry. I mean, how could you not ask these questions? You observe a phenomenon in this physical world, you see the stark differences in ways of life, and you want to understand these differences. And because the most elegant solution is often the simplest solution, your search for the most essential reason for this observable phenomenon leads you to deduce that the reason must be skin color. Enter science. But before science, there was God. The question of human variation has always fascinated people, and more often than not, certain groups have cited the variations in human appearance as justification for all manner of atrocious behaviors in the service of power and greed. Almost every group has its own creation story. My ethnic group, the Igbos of southeastern Nigeria, say that the first 8 humans were created through a partnership between the god Igwe and the goddess Allah. They were perfect beings from whom the rest of our mongrel world descended. The Bible says God made man in his image, and that first man was perfect until a woman came along, and then there was a snake and an apple, and then it all went to shit. As implausible as it may sound, this creation story is the basis for much of the scientific research around why we have different humans. According to the historian Terence Keel in his fascinating book on how Christian thought became racial science, much of our present-day understanding of race derives from early modern Christian communities' needs to differentiate themselves from the precursor Judaism, where Jewish otherness helped to clarify the borders between Christian and non-Christian identity. This need to other apparently stuck and became a feature of European Christianity. It reared its ugly head again and again as Europeans embarked on their colonial projects, justifying untold horrors meted out to all the others they encountered. The age of European colonial expansion also coincided with the birth of the Enlightenment, in which a growing secularization of Europe led to the genesis of a system of thought we call science. And while the process of reasoning might have changed, the questions about humans and our origins did not. Keel argues that Enlightenment thinkers not only considered the same questions previously explained by religion, such as the origin of man, but they fused, in quotes, a fundamentally Christian intellectual history and the modern hope for a scientific account of our beginnings, thus birthing modern racial science. In fact, the broad categories, racial categories we still use today can be attributed to one dude, a German physician and anatomist, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. This is the dude who basically decided that people originating from the Caucasus mountain region in present-day Georgia, had the most exquisite anatomy, and that if God made man in God's image, then Caucasians, as he called them, would be most like God. The rest of us degenerated thusly, and the level of our degeneration from pure caucasity could be determined by our skin color. I'm sure you could guess who Blumenbach thought degenerated the most. Now, there are a couple of steps between Blumenbach and white supremacists carrying tiki torches and warding off the threat to white civilization by shouting, "You will not replace us," after sending off for 23andMe DNA ancestry kits. But I begin there because Blumenbach and his contemporaries bequeathed to all of what we recognize as modern science two things that have profoundly impacted the way we explore human difference. First, it's this idea that you can actually divide humans into elemental groups where there's some semblance of a pure biological constitution. And second, as I mentioned earlier, are these broad categories of human, Africans, Asians, Caucasians, Americans, and Malayan, that roughly correspond to observable skin colors. Literally all of modern science around the variance in human beings, and yes, including supposedly infallible genetics, which is supposed to definitively tell us where and what group we belong to, derives from this one guy's theory. What a remarkable feat it is to author the scientific basis for so much exploitation and animosity. There should really be a medal for that. European colonial expansion didn't need Blumenbach's theories to support the brutal seizure and subjugation of land, resources, and people from the dark-skinned hordes further south and west. Christianity worked just fine for this, thank you very much. But Blumenbach and his intellectual progeny, of which there are many, did provide a veneer of rationality to the whole extractive colonial enterprise that nicely reflected the growing use of science in the service of politics and economics to justify exploitation of the other for productivity and economic growth. The award-winning science journalist Angela Saini catalogs a slew of Blumenbach's descendants in her book Superior, The Return of Race Science, before channeling the scholars Karen and Barbara Fields when she writes, "They explain how a sense of inevitability gets attached to a social routine until it comes to be seen as natural. The idea of race didn't make people treat other people as subhuman. They were already treated as subhuman before race was invoked. But once it was invoked, the subjugation took on a new force." Saini later adds, and quote, "It's not difficult to see that the reason anyone pursued the scientific idea of race was not so much to understand the differences in our bodies, as it was to try to justify why we live such different lives." So to the question, why do they live like this, and why have they not been able to build worlds like ours, a conclusion slowly starts to form. There's just something about them, something in their blood, something elemental that makes them inferior and us superior. It's why we have what we have and they don't. It's why we were able to create the science that underpins our modern civilization and they could not. It's why they will never have what we have and why we should do our best to build that wall and turn back those boats. All the desert-scorched and saltwater-soaked kids be damned. You heard what I said, right? It's why we were able to create the science that underpins our modern civilization, and they could not. Let's all just reflect on this for a moment. This means that to many Europeans and more broadly Westerners, consciously and or subconsciously, the dark-skinned hordes exist outside of science. And this conclusion has a profound implication for how science is treated in relation to parts of the world populated by dark-skinned people, in particular the continent of Africa where my family is from. If you'll allow me to digress for a moment, I want to tell you 3 real-life stories. The first happened to my older sister and has shaped her and my worldviews. If you'll allow me to brag for a moment, my sister, Dr. Onyi Iwala, who graduated with honors in biochemistry from Harvard and holds an MD from Harvard Medical School and a PhD in experimental pathology and mucosal immunology, I don't even know what that is, from Harvard University, is an assistant professor with a lab at the University of North Carolina. She's been quoted in the New York Times on rare meat allergies, in addition to the numerous scientific papers she's written and studies she's co-authored. I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure that she's a real-life scientist. And also, did I mention that she's African? But we'll come back to this. When we were undergraduates at Harvard, my sister was at the forefront of a push to get Harvard University to open up its much-celebrated core curriculum, a set of must-take courses designed to create well-rounded students who will lead the world. She wanted to add more content related to Africa. She told me about a meeting she had with then university president, the world-famous economist Larry Summers. When she visited the president's office with their proposal to add Africa to the core, he looked at them, leaned back, put his feet up on his desk, and said, "Look, it's not like we can have African math." The second happened to a Chinese-American friend of mine who had a meeting with the then Dean of Admissions at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, where we both attended medical school. This otherwise genial old white man, a well-respected nephrologist, took my friend aside and said to him, in regards to the different capabilities of the races, to paraphrase, "They just have a different kind of intelligence from us. We have a more intellectual intelligence, and the blacks have a more physical intelligence." You wouldn't be shocked if I told you that Columbia's medical school classes included what felt like a disproportionate number of blonde-haired, blue-eyed white men who would be the champions of tomorrow's medical science, and fewer dark-skinned men and women like me who, according to this lovely man, should have been doing something physical, like, I don't know, playing basketball, or maybe even picking cotton. Then there's my youngest brother, who graduated with honors in economics at Harvard before doing a joint MD-MBA at Harvard Medical and Business Schools. He's a spine surgeon and the co-author of 4 papers on spinal surgery. He has regularly been mistaken for the food delivery person in the hospital, physical intelligence indeed, and even been clicked at in an imitation of African tongues by senior physicians in the operating room. All of these incidents happened in the 21st century. And yes, you can groan. It makes me sick to my stomach, too. I tell you this not to emphasize how smart my siblings are. They're pretty damn smart. But to make clear how easy it is to get from a belief in the narrative that dark-skinned folks are inferior and exist outside of science to real-life impacts of that reasoning. Now, my siblings and I have it very easy. We're from a family of means. My father's a neurosurgeon, my mother a development economist, and the former finance minister of Nigeria. And this is what we face. Do you have to imagine what those who are less insulated experience? I mean, you don't. You can just watch the news to find out what happens to the rest. So having relegated us to the margins of science by using this same science to determine our elemental inferiority, narratives about how we interacted with, or rather were acted upon by science, were baked into the West's collective understanding and have formed tropes that haunt us and their creators ever since. Take, for example, this extremely well-written and engaging New Yorker article from its December 12, 2010 edition that is perhaps one of the most god-awful and offensive pieces of science journalism I've ever encountered. And trust me, if you've worked on journalism around HIV, you've encountered a lot. Titled "The Doomsday Strain," and written by the award-winning journalist Michael Spector, it features an intrepid American virologist, Nathan Wolfe, whose life conforms more to the pattern of life conforms more to the pattern of a 19th century explorer than that of a 21st century biologist. He rides around Africa, end quote. He rides around Africa despairing over benighted Africans dragging primate bushmeat around. In quotes, "When I see a monkey like that dragged through the street, bloody on the way to market, it looks like a loaded weapon. It scares me," Wolfe says. The implication, of course, is that one of these desperate monkey-eating members of the dark-skinned horde could inadvertently start a global pandemic that would impact Europe or the United States just by having lunch. And this Western scientist has flown in to save us from ourselves. This same article is replete with gems like, in quotes, "It isn't easy for a foreigner or anyone else to tell rural Africans how to conduct their lives. Customs vary widely. On one of my first visits to a village in Cameroon, I was with my ex-wife," Wolf recalled recently. "When we arrived, the chief looked at her and asked me, 'Ça, c'est pour moi?' It took a second for me to get what he was asking." And then there's the piece's final sentence delivered when an author asks a village woman what she's done when she sees dead chimpanzees and gorillas in the forest. She responds, quote, "I thanked God, picked them up, and brought them home for dinner." If you think this is bad, then you won't have the stomach for some of the articles I've read about Africa and HIV/AIDS. So yeah, it's bad. But here, we can turn to the MIT professor Clapperton Mavunga and his essay, "What Do Science, Technology, and Innovation Mean for Africa?" to understand what's happening. He writes of science and technology narratives across Africa. The inbound, besides that, in quote, "brought by the European colonizers," was coming from sites of production marked by exclusions on the basis of race and gender. It was mostly produced by white males, and it was coming to make wealth, power, and prestige for them in Africa. In Nathan Wolfe, we're returned to Blumenbach's figure of the perfect Caucasian male, closer to God and of rational scientific mind at the center of the story. Now the subject of this prestigious New Yorker magazine, surrounded by degenerate Africans who are literally, physically closer to non-human primates, drenched, Specter writes, in their blood, almost commingling fluids as if to suggest some ritualistic kinship ceremony. This is the narrative thrust that animates much of science journalism in some form or another. Mavunga theorizes the propaganda around Western imperialism as civilizing mission was that Europe and later America alone had a monopoly of technology to transfer to a dark, primitive world. In other words, these stories originate from the idea of fundamental difference between those who created science, white Western males, and those who are acted upon by science, the lower-formed, dark-skinned others. And it rewrites the story over and over again across the spectrum of offensive and dehumanizing language, from the articles like this Doomsday Strain to the only merely patronizing, while making two fundamental mistakes. First, as Mavunga says, always the narrative starts from the colonial onward, ignoring that people of the South were already technological before colonialism happened. And second, science and science journalism that makes use of distinctions between people of different skin tone and either overtly or subtly attaches those distinctions to ownership of the scientific process is making supposedly rational pronouncements on one man's emotionally driven categorization. In other words, because an 18th century white man said racial distinctions are rational, they're rational. We've based the whole branch of journalism and the whole focus of science on this simplistically elegant, vicious cycle of warped self-references. But it need not continue this way. In fact, our survival demands we break this vicious cycle. This is where science journalists come in. As Mavunga defiantly posits, Africa must be repositioned in technology as other than its pitiable victim. The younger generation, our children, our children's children, will require a positive African story to be inspired and to aspire. But it's more than just positive stories. It's also questioning the very definition of what is considered science. My African scientist sister reminds me that science is a system shaped by very specific cultural norms of a very certain set of people. She says, "I've been trained in a Western way of doing science. It's completely not neutral or rational. It's systematic, but you incorporate your ideas and biases into the system. Other people from other backgrounds, not bound by the ways we are trained in the West, might have different approaches and perspectives. And so you might push new ideas, new discoveries, if you include them," she told me. How refreshing to encounter a scientist who recognizes the limits of the currently constructed popular narrative of science as some great European-generated universal constant. She, like Mavunga, wonders whether we can really be certain that what we call Western science, technology, and innovation is indeed Western in origin, ingredients, and rationality. If you're firmly invested in precarious racial categorizations that Western science has built, then questioning the Western origin of science can feel like sacrilege. But if you're a science journalist, it brings to me the first of three questions we must ask ourselves as journalists to save science, journalism, and perhaps the world. First, we must ask ourselves, are we willing to acknowledge the truth no matter what that means, no matter where that takes us? There's a reason why politicians and political systems try to co-opt, discredit, and when all else fails, kill journalists. At our best, we're truth tellers. Truth can and does often put people in a vulnerable position. And for leaders or groups of people who are deeply invested in myth, the journalist can be the most dangerous of presences. I know that some of us might want to hide behind the idea that science journalism is removed from politics, but science is politics, and therefore science journalism is inherently political. As I hope I've shown, there is a myth of Eurocentric white superiority that science holds dear, and that informs science journalism's understanding of science. It's why very few articles on science and race truly question the racial categories science has set up and seeks to prove. It's why newspapers can write on white supremacists taking home DNA tests while making scarce mention of the fact that these kits basically tell you nothing absolute about your origins. What does it mean to be told by science that you're 35% German, 25% British, 25% Scandinavian, whatever that is, and 15% Italian? There's not really enough time to go into the complicated algorithms behind these percentage scores, but let's just say I've been curious enough to visit the 23andMe headquarters in Menlo Park looking for an answer. And yes, I actually did that. So what claim does that really give one to the benefits of an enlightenment mode of thinking? What justification is that for shouting, "You will not replace us," at someone not having that same percentage breakdown? Or more subtly, in polite company, declaring science as a European birthright? A lot has been said about the inconvenient truths that science journalists have to face. Well, let's face them boldly and be vocal about it. But there's another step to truth-telling. In our presence today, it's not enough to shine a light. We have to write in ways that actively address the wrongs engendered by these myths. You can't write about climate change without being clear about who's most responsible. If you want to claim the good about being Western, then you have to claim the bad. And Europe and the West are responsible for the vast majority of environmental damage the world has faced. Europe and the West are directly and indirectly responsible for the vast majority of resulting forced migration. That's related to science. As journalists, we have to say that. We have to be clear that there is no money for basic science research in a country like Cameroon or Congo because the French and the Belgians took pretty much everything they could. That's one of the main reasons why you don't have a CERN outside of Kinshasa or an EPFL equivalent 3 miles from the center of Abidjan. So no more euphemistic sentences to coddle easily threatened sensibilities. No more artful dodges, but real talk, the truth. This brings me to the second question that we must ask ourselves. And that's, does my journalism put people at the center, not just the more often than not white male scientist? But further, does our work demand of the scientists we cover an answer to the question, how will this change our lives? And we must also remember that this hour is the global hour, and it must include the most vulnerable amongst us. That kid in Nairobi, Kenya, in Kibera, Nairobi, Kenya, she'll feel the full force of quantum computing or CRISPR engineering or carbon capture technology, even if it is, and more likely than not, it will be negative for her. The world needs to know this. In this present moment of crisis where human lives are at stake, there is no such thing as science for the sake of science. That's vanity at its purest. Science, whether you're studying quantum theory, machine learning, or botany, needs to be human-centered, even if it also pushes the truth that we as humans have an obligation to decenter ourselves in our narratives of the planet Earth and the wider universe. This is all, of course, until the aliens find us or AI takes over, and then we'll just do what our non-human overlords demand. But finally follows my third question. Are we building news platforms and newsrooms with diverse perspectives? If, as a scientist, my sister can have as the mission statement of her lab to make groundbreaking discoveries in immunology that lead to effective therapies for allergic conditions, and to inspire a large, diverse cohort of others to do the same, then are we, as journalists, reaching beyond the usual suspects when we tell stories, when we hire, when we train ourselves in this mission to positively change the world? I know we're all under-resourced, understaffed, and overworked, but honestly, let's just cut the shit and do it. We owe it to those who come after us. Can you mentor someone from a group who traditionally does not have access, or who has a different understanding of what is science? Can you share knowledge with your colleagues in another country through regular dialogue over email, WhatsApp, Skype, talking drums if you have to? But even as you seek to share your knowledge, ask yourself, am I listening? Am I open? Being committed to telling the truth will help this process. Being centered will help this process. Being people-centered will help this process. But like all things, there's an act of will involved. For the avoidance of doubt, I'm not just speaking to Western science journalists. I'm talking about us all. For those who operate in less resourced countries, we have an obligation to do exactly the same internally and externally. We know our colleagues in the so-called West often don't remember us. So we must make them, and we must be confident about it. We may not know all that they know, but they most certainly don't know everything that we know because of the cycle of self-reference in the service of power. Our survival, our children's survival, their survival, everyone's survival literally depends on us teaching them the things we know, and also reminding, forcefully, if necessary, that we exist and we're human, just like them. Their categorizations of humans be damned. So my 23andMe test kit came in the mail 2 weeks after the Charlottesville terrorist rallies. Like at least 2 million other humans, I opened the beautifully packaged rainbow-colored test kit, summoned up as much saliva as I could, spat in a tube, and unwittingly donated my genetic material to our new class of corporate overlords. All the while wondering why I was so anxious about the results that would come back, wondering why science has been so concerned with obtaining scientific validation for what at base is an emotionally influenced social distinction. Geneticists today seem to coalesce around the idea that over the last several 100,000 or so years that humans have existed, there has been so much migration of genes and exchange of DNA as to render any attempt to truly infer clear-cut and essential differences in humanness meaningless. And yet, still we search for a scientific basis to justify our behaviors, our worser behaviors. To justify why a white slave-holding surgeon, J. Marion Sims, could perform experimental surgeries without anesthesia on black women in the name of science. For this, he earned the title the father of gynecology. Or as justification that Nazi doctors used when performing experiments on Jewish twins in concentration camps. Or as justification for the setup of new concentration camps we're filling on the southern border of the United States and in the boats we turn back from our shores. This is real. This is the impact that science and narratives about science can have on people. As science journalists, we have the power to fuel people to march through the night with torches shouting, "You cannot replace us." Or we can encourage people to change the world while singing, "This land is your land, this land is my land, this land was made for you and me." And in case you were wondering, I got my DNA test results back. It's confirmed. I'm 100% human. Thank you.
Nicely done. Thank you.
Very good.
Wow, thank you for that. I've pondered 23andMe for a while, but
Have you done it?
No, no, not.
Just
didn't go
depends on
that
who you
step.
want
Just
to own your...
keep wondering about it.
I mean, it depends on who you want to own your DNA. So.
Yeah. So curious, how many people have done that around here in the audience? Oh, there's one, two. I can only see 2 hands. Wow.
I mean, so I'll tell you, it's actually really interesting. And part of what I started thinking about with that is when I first did my results about, I mean, this was, 2 years ago, you know, you get it back, and because they didn't have very many people from, I guess, West Africa or Africa, like, the results were basically 99.8% West African was like what I got. And, you know, as compared to some of my friends who were like, literally those breakdowns, 25% Scandinavian, 35%, you know, like French or whatever. And so I asked a friend, and that's what started this whole odyssey about like going to the 23andMe office to actually find out what exactly was going on. And you know, over the course of 2 years, as their algorithms have changed and as their resolution has gotten better, like, you know, the sort of my makeup has changed. So I'm now 90, like, you know, something 0.3% Nigerian as opposed to West African, and the rest is like Congolese and whatever. At one point in time, I was a little bit Native American, which I found really interesting. You know, and so like, it's just to say that like those tests, like in the writing about those tests and the conversation about those tests, like, you know, it can be very misleading. And I think the companies themselves actually try to make that clear. But, you know, once you start with a certain narrative and it just gets put out there, it can take on a life of its own.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what happened. And yeah, I mean, in more than one instance, they try to explain that it's not exactly what people are thinking about it. But yeah, that does take a life of its own. Thank you for that. That was fascinating, and quite a few things to sink our teeth in. And just to tell everyone around, we're going to have some questions here, but then there are mics on the 2 aisles in the middle, and we will be taking questions in maybe a few minutes. So if you have any questions, please hold on to them, and then we can get as many questions as we can for the time we have. So I was really fascinated about this idea of homegrown science, but also homegrown science journalism, because I think even in conferences like this, we've often had, or through the World Federation of Science Journalists, where we've often had this idea or conception maybe that knowledge would move from north to south. Which in many reasons is, in many situations is relevant. We don't have that many science journalism schools, I'd say, in Africa. But there are so many experiences, so many unique experiences that we've had that are quite relevant to the north as well. I'm very curious how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, we make these distinctions, or we make this sort of like, we have this like this narrative again of how knowledge moves, which, you know, as this scholar, for those who are interested, Clapperton Mavunga, that his books and his essays really talk about how much of a made-up narrative that is, how you discount one knowledge that is brought and sort of brought up in countries in Africa or around the world where people don't consider places that generate science. Like, you know, not speaking about, you know, just at base, like some of the intellectual property that has been lifted and taken, whether it's in the form of people's like blood, whether it's in the form of local knowledge, that's then, you know, quote unquote refined in the north or whatever, that same process or sort of thought that people have about extraction and refinement and then resale. But also I think, and that's what I was trying to get at a little bit, what my sister has talked with me about, and what he also mentions in his book, is this idea that like, there's a very particular definition of what science is, right? That privileges the West. And that, you know, it's not to say that that's not, you know, and I think people get very testy about this. That's not to invalidate that at all, right? As you know, she said, it's a system of thought that has produced really remarkable results, and like that should be credited. But it's also to say that that's not the only story, and that there are also systems of knowledge that you can draw from. And so when she's constituting her lab or thinking about what she wants to study, she starts thinking about how do you find stories, and also how do you find people from other places that can bring in different perspectives to the work that you do. It makes everything richer. And I think that's the argument. You know, that's saying, That's the argument for why you also want to train more people to speak about science, but also think more broadly about what science is within the context of the continent, or other places that are not traditionally considered places that generate science. Now we're talking about the West and China.
Yeah. Do you feel that part of the problem might be that we as science journalists from the developing world have not been the best advocates for what we do?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, well, there are two things. One is Mavunga writes about this as well, like this idea of sort of despair, right? Which is that this feeling that the West or the developed world, whatever you want to call it, is so far ahead, and we don't have anything to contribute, and that might be exhibited in the ways that we write about ourselves. That's real. That needs to be acknowledged, and that needs to be corrected, right? So there's an issue of psychology and sort of bolstering. But how do you change that? It's by putting up examples of people who've done really great work. I mean, a lot of people don't know about like a lot of the scientific discoveries that were done by people who are not from, or technological discoveries, or things that were done for people who are not from these places. So if you think about Norway, for example, and the discovery of oil and its sovereign wealth fund, one of the major guys behind that is actually an Iraqi, originally an Iraqi, right? If you think about things in like open heart surgery in the United States, and this is a big one, right? The person who got credit for it is this Johns Hopkins professor, a white guy. But the guy who actually developed the techniques was somebody who wasn't even allowed to enter in through the same door into the hospital. And yet he was the one who was doing all of the techniques and figuring out exactly what to do at night. That was a black man. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
all of these things are there. So it's bringing up those stories,
It's
right?
just these stories that
that are there. That's
they're there,
one.
but nobody
Nobody
really knows about them.
Right. And then two, it's about fighting for space on platforms. It's about creating platforms that people can see, right? And also fighting for space on platforms that, have global purchase, right? So we were talking about this yesterday about, say, like nature, right? And having that expand and having it in different places, right? So where you can publish more people from different areas, scientific papers and whatnot. My sister talks about this a lot in terms of how do you bring other people into the fold, colleagues that she has or people that she knows on the continent that she corresponds with. How do you give them a platform so that people can see that science is happening, both in the way that it happens in the West and also in different ways?
Yeah, and I think that taps into this idea that you mentioned of how science should be, I guess, more human-centric. And I wonder, how do you think that science journalists, or even scientists, let's say, but I mean, focus on science journalists from the global South can grow and feel more comfortable in our own culture of science journalism, rather than something that we feel we have to, let's say, import from the North?
I mean, I think the first thing, and this comes from the example that I have of setting up Ventures Africa, so when we set up that publication, we're not specifically focused on science, although we do a lot of tech reporting on the continent. Like, and this was, by necessity, we hired locally, right? We hired locally from universities in Lagos, where it's headquartered. And then we just trained people to write in the way that we thought was best to tell the stories that we needed to tell. And what's really important? These are people who had the desire to tell stories, but didn't necessarily have the skills to tell stories, but like had that real drive. And what then happens is you create your own culture, and you have to be proud of that culture. I mean, we were very proud of our culture as a publication, and it showed. I mean, one of my biggest problems was being able to retain people, because we are a startup publication. We would pay people, as well as we could, but it wasn't what, say, Bloomberg could pay them. And Bloomberg would come in and, offer one of my writers more, and I would gladly say, go. If you can get paid more, get paid more. But what I think that said to us is that people were seeing, and the other thing is no one knew that all of the writers that first of all, they thought we had 100 writers or whatever, like across the continent. We really only had 10 people. And second, like no one knew that none of the writers were trained outside. Everyone was trained in Nigeria.
Right.
And, so I mean, but that, like, for us felt good. I would have loved to keep the writers. I mean, you don't want to subsidize Michael Bloomberg. He's got enough money already. but like I think it says something about what happens when you create your own culture. And I think the other thing to remember is in each media environment, like each media environment has its own culture and has its own norms, and not everything. It's just like in the same way. I was reading this article about how democracy is indigenous to each environment and each set of people. That there is no model democracy because if there were, then the United States and the UK would have. Like you could say that they would have similar democracies, and they don't, and neither of them seems to be working at this point in time. So what is anyone supposed to look to? And I think it's being proud of the systems that you can generate yourself, but also making sure that those systems have their own internal checks and standards of quality. And to do that, that doesn't mean that you shut out everyone else. You can reference other places, like you can look at best practices. You can say, these people over there have done it really well. What can we imitate? What can we mimic? Because there's another thing that I think is interesting, which is that now everybody's so focused on original ideas. And the truth was a lot of innovation is just imitation. You just find somebody who's done something and say, all right, let me see if I can do it better.
Yeah.
I think that's fine.
Yeah.
China does it.
Very well. So just to follow up on that, I think that's a very interesting idea. And just to play the devil's advocate here a bit, you were able to create a publication that was able to create a culture of science journalism that people can be proud of. I'm sure your writers are proud to be able to write in your publication. But you are based in the US.
Well, so just like Ventures Africa is based in Nigeria. And so I actually just moved to the US to do the job I'm doing now. Right.
So it was set up in
Nigeria. It was set up in Nigeria, entirely in Nigeria, and employed only Nigerians, and worked entirely with Africans across the continent, through networks of journalists. But like, we were a very local publication.
Right.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I'm so proud of, is the fact that it's folks from Nigeria who stepped up and said, we have, and it's not, it's a much broader publication, but stepped up and said, we have stories to tell, and figured out how to tell those stories. Didn't get everything right, for sure. I think that's the point of running a startup, is you're going to mess up a bunch of things up, but at least in iterating, kept trying to build its own culture.
And in your experience, what would your advice be to someone who wants to recreate this across Africa or Latin America or Southern East?
I mean, the main thing is that it's about dedication. I mean, look, everything costs money, and one of the things is you need to have some money to start. We had some money to start, right? And I know that not everyone has that, but it's not just money, right? You can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have dedication and a philosophy behind what you're doing, then you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to literally, you might do better to set the money on fire. And I think that's what we had, which showed was that there was a dedication to telling our stories and to developing a way and a language for telling those stories that, again, could improve, that would reference things from outside, but at the same time, was very much about who we are. And I think that applies. When you start talking more specifically about science journalism, I think, people get into this thing where people feel like there's some objective standard or whatever. And you want to be factual for sure, but you also have to remember that these things are, again, as my sister, the scientist, said, people come to these things with biases. It's why certain things get studied and certain things don't get studied, right? It's why certain things get funded and other things don't, right? And you have to remember that even as you create. So your bias is not necessarily invalid. You just have to be aware of it.
I think, one example that pops to mind, and tell me if this is how you feel about it, is if you're doing a story about, I don't know, let's say climate change, you can write it in a way that is much more relevant to Africa while still pretty much employing the same science bases and the same information that you have, but it would be more relevant to the African experience.
Right. 100%. And I think when you look at a lot of articles about climate change, they're not relevant to the you don't have to question that science. You can say, look, Earth is getting warmer. We all know that, right? But the question is, are you saying that, Earth is getting warmer woe is me, like these people are now coming to like live in my country? Or are you saying Earth is getting warmer? Can you flip it and be like, the Earth is getting warmer because these people have burned fossil fuels for the last X hundred years? And like, it's a matter of perspective. And like, okay, so now what do we do? And then when you think about that, this is where you get into the political implications. You start thinking about, okay, how do you redistribute resources? Because we all know that those who have stolen a lot of the resources to fund this growth, right, will be the ones who are best able to adapt to climate change, right? That's a political thing, right? Now, how do you make sure that everyone in the world is positioned to deal with climate change? It's also a political thing. It's about redistribution of resources. Now, if you don't report on that at the same time you start speaking about the science of warming, then you've lost the plot entirely, in my opinion.
Then it's not really.
Then, I mean, what are you like? What are you really talking about?
I see what you mean. We can open the floor to questions. I have some light right in my eyes. Plab, there are mics down the aisle. I think I see it. Yeah, I see it. Sorry, there's just light in our eyes. There's one here and one there. If you have questions, can you please line up so that we can save some time? We'll start with Palab's question, please.
Hi, this is Palab Ghosh from BBC News. Thanks for a fantastic talk, Uzzudin, and a fantastic conversation. I have to say I felt really challenged as a science journalist because I've grown up doing my job thinking of science mostly as a liberal thing that was perhaps distorted by evil corporations and whatever, but usually a force for good. And also as science journalism, reporting on good things that led to good actions. And of course, it's not necessarily always the case. And I was just wondering what your perspective was for us, experienced or new science journalists, how we should think when covering just our day-to-day beat stories.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for that. And I think one of the things that has become clear to me, and in writing the book I wrote about HIV/AIDS, for example, and reading like through tons of scientific papers on HIV, on behavior, et cetera, is just that there is a group think, and the issue is like, how do you challenge and who do you speak to that can help you step outside of that group think? So, more concretely, when I wrote that book, one of the things I did was, I spoke to a bunch of scientists. Yes, I read, a bunch of papers, but I also just went out and was like, all right, let me post up at a bus stop in Nigeria and just understand what are the narratives that people have about HIV/AIDS, the people who haven't written or read scientific papers. Like, how do people tell stories about this in their own daily lives, and how does that then inform the way that all the stuff scientists want to happen actually happens, right? So you can get up and say that treatment should be done as X, right? But if people's understanding of the phenomenon doesn't correspond to sort of your sort of lab-based or whatever, you're not having a conversation. And I think for me that's the most fundamental thing, which is that it comes down to, okay, so what are even if those perspectives sometimes seem like they are just wacky or sort of not within the framework of how science is done or reported on, those perspectives, you don't have to, some of them will be just nonsense, and you can discard the ones that are nonsense, but some of them are actually going to shift your perspective. And I think that's really, really important because it will make you go back to your table and think through what's happening. I mean, for me, for example, with this DNA testing, I was like, all right, it's DNA testing. Of course, it's going to tell me who I am. And when I got back these results, I started speaking to a friend of mine who's actually a computational biologist. And it was through him that he then started explaining to me how all of this stuff happened. And look, I went to medical school. I feel like I know a little something, right? I didn't know anything, right? And that started this odyssey of how do you figure out okay, what exactly is the science behind this, and how do I change my perspective? And then how does that impact my larger political perspective about who we really actually are as humans? And I look at you and you're from a certain place, I look at me and I'm from a certain place, and I make a judgment, a value judgment, or a way of relating to you based off of that might be entirely nonsensical,
Do you think it's purely in the biological sciences that applies, or does it apply more widely?
No, I think it applies more widely, and I think this is where I get to this idea of these are political decisions. It's about what you research. I mean, the fact that folks are not, for example, the fact that you can have nuclear power and research in the United States, but Iran can't, right? that's a decision based off of all of these other things that applies to something that's, not biological science. It's like physics, right? The fact that we spent so much time on fossil fuels and not any on like alternative sources of energy or renewable energy or nuclear power, that's again, that's a political decision that's based off of, in a lot of cases, like, you could trace it back to some of these racial things. You could trace it back to like who deserves what, and those are emotional decisions, not necessarily rational ones.
Thank you.
Hi, Natasha Mitchell from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Thank you for your absolutely stunning presentation, absolute highlight for me.
Thank you.
And I'm just interested in your reflections on the arrival of eugenics in the modern marketplace, in a sense. So I guess it taps into your 23andMe experience and the rise of what some describe as a liberal eugenics, a new eugenics, and the sort of intersection with personalised medicine, in a sense. I mean, there was a controversy around Bardil and the notion that we might develop drugs that are personalised for particular races or cultural groups.
Right.
This is such an interesting time we live in, and I wonder how you look at that
Yeah.
phenomenon in the context of the history
Right.
of eugenics.
Right. Well, thank you very much first, but I'll start with I'm not an expert, and this is for me, a lot of this is just like real curiosity for me.
Yeah.
What I can say is that when you start reading about some of this stuff, I mean, first of all, I think everyone's confused, right? Because, I mean, everything everywhere is uncertain. That's number one. Number two, I think when it comes to some of these things, like you have half of the people who are arguing there's real value in sort of like this idea of racialized science and like determining like how different cures, drugs, diseases, whatever affect people from different places, right? I think the thing is, it's how do you develop an understanding, a language, and a methodology for dealing with that when the very basis for the categories of race are themselves kind of ridiculous, right? That's a very big problem, right? So there's an example of somebody who did a study in which they said that like African American women have a gene that makes them more susceptible to dying of a certain kind of cancer. Okay, fine. You put all those, numbers and like, fancy terms, and people are like, oh my goodness, we've discovered something. And then you take a step back and you ask yourself, like, wait, so who is an African American, right? An African American is more likely than not a person who is a blend of people like DNA from the continent, if we're even getting into this absurdity, like from the continent to like European, a lot of European like DNA, like a lot of Native American, so what exactly in that person is corresponding to this, and like how broadly are you taking the term African American, right? And so that becomes a really big issue when you start making these pronouncements. That's even on the positive side. On the negative side, you can look at things like people looking for genes that like speak to violence, and saying that African Americans have a higher, likelihood of lacking certain genes that produce chemicals that reduce violence. Or you can look at, like all these studies that people just seem to not be able to let rest about like intelligence, right? And wanting to prove over and over again that like certain races, again, however sillily defined those are smarter than others, right? People just can't let it go. I don't know why, just can't, right? So that's one. I think the interesting question about like personalized medicine, again, like this is way above my pay grade, but like I think it's really fascinating to think like, what can you do? But like not just what can you do, like what should we allow ourselves as a society to do, right? And that's where you need to start talking to all the bioethicists and also, people at large, is like should we be able to engineer humans? Should we be able to eliminate diseases? What does it mean to live in a society or a world where there isn't any, or certain people who have the money? And this will more likely than not be along sort of lines that racial lines that we have defined, right? We'll have the money to eliminate diseases, through this personalized genetic, medicine, and other people will just not, right? And then you'll live in a world that is, absolutely ridiculous. The funny thing is, we've actually done that now already, right? Which is, when you look at, average height of people in certain places, or you look at sort of like the sort of under 5 mortality in certain places, that's selection along, racial, ethnic, geographical lines that is having an impact on population. So we're already doing it. We just haven't doubled down on studying like what it means.
Thank you. Thanks.
Can we take one more question from here, and then Veronique? Helen, how are we with time? We started a bit late, so.
We're good. Let's take the question.
Okay. Oh, please, can you go ahead because you were there first, and then Veronique?
Okay, all right. So my name is Helen Gavigan from Science, People and Politics. I just need to make a couple of observations before asking you the question. So last time I was in Geneva, it was for a World Health Assembly meeting, and there was a marked lack of representation from African countries. And actually part of why I was here tonight was because I was anticipating seeing a lot more people actually representative of African countries. It happens a lot, and at the moment I'm also researching a book where I've looked at a number of international events that are going on and studies, and there is a marked lack of any representation from the intellectual people in African universities or African organizations. Those are the observations. Okay, you were the editor and the publisher. What did you do about this stuff?
Well, I mean, so let me just say first.
What kind of stories did you write?
Yeah, so first of all, like when it comes to things like this, there's a very basic reason for why that happens. And it's like a lot simpler than you think. Like I'm here because I have an American passport. Like if I had a Nigerian passport, it'd be a lot harder for me to get here. And for a lot of other people, like that's just the thing. I mean, like I can't tell you, and I just want to make this clear, right? Like, you know, one has to be very clear about where the problems lie. Like if people had more free movement, right? If you were ready to accept people to come in and you didn't have situations where you invite someone to speak and it's 2 months before they get a visa, or you ask them about like their sister's, like husband's, like cousin's personal finances before you give them a visa, like then you would actually have people, like a wider set of people and a wider range of people here. Now, for us, like specifically, again, my publication was broader based than just sort of science. Like we did like culture, business, policy, technology. The whole purpose of our publication was actually to give people who didn't necessarily have a platform to write, to speak, to talk about their things. And so we tried to do a variety of articles, but again, like as I say, like, you know, I'm proud of what we did, but we were working with not so many people, trying to figure out like how we did this. And so, you know, that's us. I think when you start thinking about publications on the continent, you have to think about that. Like what are the resources available to people, and how are they using those resources as best as possible? Now, people can, like, you can screw that up, right? And I think we've probably done that, and you can improve. And I think the whole point is like, where are you starting from and where are you trying to get to, and are you bringing more voices on? That's an internal question. As for the external question of representation and voices, y'all got to ask yourselves and your editors, like, why is it so hard for people to get on these platforms?
How good are your politicians at making a noise to make sure you get the invitations and the representation? So back to yourselves, did you hold your own politicians to account and say, excuse me, we don't have World Health Assembly representation, there's this happening internationally, we're not getting our voice heard. What are you, as our politicians, doing? How good a job did you do?
So I'll throw the question back to you. Are you guys asking your own politicians about how easy it is for people to come into these places? That's one.
Yes.
Two, second question is, I think when you look at some of these things, for example, if you look at the COP conferences, or you look at, you know, like other things, like, can people do better? Yes, they can, right, for sure. Are there people actually raising a ruckus about why, for example, there isn't as much representation at some of these conferences? Go on Twitter and take a look at like Nigerian environmentalists talking about like what's going on, like we need more people, we need to talk about these issues. So again, like there's something to be said for, can it be done better? Yes. There's also something a little bit interesting about, you know, being questioned about that in that way. Do you know what I mean? Like, are we making a ruckus? Like, people are always complaining to the politicians. People want things to be better. Do people live in places where they can necessarily do that? Not everybody does, right? I think that's the first thing to remember. So being able to speak to people, even having access, is a real luxury. And that's like, that is not a That's not a joke, right? Number one. Number two is, like, yes, people are trying. Like, so I would never like approach a situation thinking that people aren't trying and that people aren't making a noise. There are many issues that people are speaking about, that people are raising their voices about in ways that are appropriate for the environments in which they exist. And I think we have to commend those people even as we ask them to do more.
I certainly have
Can I,
Nigerian.
I'm sorry, we can have a back and forth
we can
afterwards.
talk about it later. Because I think
because we're running out of time. I'd like to take one more question. I'm really sorry, Helen, but I'd like to take one more short question from here, Veronique.
Yeah, hi.
Because we really need to wrap up because we're late. I'm sorry.
My name is Véronique Morin. I'm from Quebec, Canada. I'm a journalist, long-time involvement in the World Federation of Science Journalists. And many years ago, I got interested in the relationship between science, scientists, modern science, and indigenous people. So I started following scientists on indigenous communities, and I actually have a panel on Thursday about this issue on Thursday afternoon. So I was really pleased to hear you. Thank you so much. I have one quick question for you, but it requires a whole book to answer it. Right. I just would like to get your perspective on homegrown knowledge in Africa and how it was prior to the arrival of white men and modern science.
So I am so not qualified to answer that question. But thank you very much for your comments. I literally am not qualified to answer that question. I have a little brother who is not a doctor, but who has read a lot about these things. He's probably way more qualified than me. I do think, you know, and I don't know if you've read this guy Clapperton Mavunga. I think he's worth reading because his two books, one is about specifically the tsetse fly, and the other is this collection of essays with different academics, writers, scholars about science in Africa, origins, and the conversation. Like talks a lot about exactly this, and how do you speak about other systems of knowledge, right, and their relationship to this sort of behemoth of Western science. And I think, you know, one of the things he says, first of all, is that understanding local scientific knowledge requires understanding local languages, right? Which is a very big thing that just kind of gets glossed over. I'll give you an example. I worked, when I was much younger, sort of right out of college, I worked for a couple of months in a internally displaced persons camp in northern Nigeria. Now, I was really interested in the time in psychiatry and was thinking that I wanted to go to medical school to become a psychiatrist. Thank God that didn't happen. But one of the things is working with the social workers and the psychiatrists who were up in this IDP camp. One of the examples the guy said to me is like, you know, folks will come out here and talk about depression. And he was like, people don't know what depression is. Like, it's not in the language. Like, when somebody talks about, like, mental illness, they'll come to me and say something like, I have ants crawling around in my head, right? You know, and he's like, I understand that because I understand the language and I know what that means. If you're coming from outside, you're like, what is this person talking about? Right? And then all of a sudden, like, you then get some of these studies that are published, like, oh, like, Nigerians are the happiest people in the world, right? And like, or, you know, such and such, there's no example of this, like, in it. Or, you know, which is frustrating, but it shows that, like, there's this sort of hegemonic understanding of science and also of language related to science, and that, like, you have to do away with that or be willing to exist outside of that to understand, I think, a lot of the stuff that you probably already know and work on. And that's where I come at it from, and that's what I'm sensitive to, and that's what I was trying to be sensitive to, for example, in the book that I wrote about HIV. But that's kind of where I start, but I'm going to stop talking before I say something I don't know.
Well, I think we do need to wrap up. I think, I mean, this discussion just reminded me of something very interesting that happened, and something maybe I'd like to wrap up with you on is about the idea of how homegrown experiences can be so different. And I always think of journalism in the Western world having grown and taken for granted the existence of democracies for so long, and things that might be very foreign to many of us in the developing world. But then a few years ago, when Trump became president, a friend of mine from the US, and there was this huge attack on the media, and a friend of mine from the US called me up, and she told me that she'd like to talk to me about some of the challenges that we face in a non-democratic landscape as journalists, because it is something they were starting to consider. It was a shock all of a sudden, and I realized that there are so many experiences that we might have internalized through our work, through our experiences with life, I guess, that could be very relevant, having grown here or grown in the global south, that might be very relevant globally as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, and I think a lot of the time, like, you know, those things are not, the attention is not given in the way that they are. This is, you know, it's this example for, like, where people say that, oh, the cell phone has changed Africa, and like, is that really the case? It's like, have local sort of circumstances dictated another kind of use for the phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, and in which case you're now telling people, like, this is how you tackle this problem. Like, there are plenty of places where, you know, like, you're going to have a lot of knowledge around, like sort of local practices to deal with climate change, right? That are going to be people teaching, you know, like, the rest of the world from local indigenous things. Like, there are so many examples of this that have happened in the past that have led to sort of discoveries in Western science, right? Like, you know, that will continue to happen. And there's so many things about political processes, you know, again, that I think are true. And that's when I say this thing about there is no perfect democracy, there's no way to teach anybody, like, how to have a democracy, because, like, people in different places, like, with different cultures, will have a different iteration of democracy than in another place. It's just going to happen. And the press's relationship to that is going to be different. You know, like, you look at the United States and you look at the UK, and it's just very different when it comes to, like, libel laws and suing people, right? Like, you know, and that's, like, a function of the media and its relationship to democracy. Like, these things, like, they matter, right? And the folks in places that we're from or have lived for a very long time, yeah, we absolutely do have a really remarkable store of knowledge, both in science and also in other matters, to disseminate to people. And the question is like, can we build the platforms that allow us to do it? And also, can you demand and like gain space on platforms that maybe have been built outside to push your case? And it's a complicated dance.
100% human, Nozadima, thank you very much. I thank you for a fascinating talk, and thank you everyone for staying up late with us. And yeah, cocktail time, I guess. So thank you.
Thanks.